I think it's fair to say that everyone wishes to be a success. Well, what does it mean to live a successful life? Many of the great thinkers in literature, philosophy, psychology, and religion challenge us to think deeply about the answer. And their answers may surprise you. Well, what are some of the standards one can use to measure success? I think it's fair to say we are familiar with the common standards used by many people: money, possessions, social status, power, sex. But I must tell you, the vast majority of the great thinkers have not used those standards to measure success. Well, what are some other possible standards? Well, one of them is self-respect. By self-respect, I mean self-esteem. I don't mean vanity. I don't mean conceit. Indeed, vanity and conceit can often be covers for a lack of self-respect. Why is self-respect so important? Well, it's been said that self-respect is the cornerstone of joy. Again, self-respect, the cornerstone of joy. Psychologists tell us that self-hatred is not uncommon, even among people of high social status. Jesus spoke of loving oneself. In Matthew 22, Jesus said, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." This raises an important question, by the way. Can one love other people if one doesn't love oneself? What to do if one doesn't respect, one doesn't love oneself? Well, psychologists recommend that, first of all, one asks oneself, why? Why is it one doesn't like oneself? And then, of course, one should examine the standards one is using to determine whether one has self-respect or not. So often, I think, in our society, the advertising and television industries can confuse people as to the standards which they should use to judge themselves and to judge whether their own lives had been successful. Again, we know that so often advertising and television push the idea that we should use money, possessions, and status as the standards. Indeed, I recall years ago a TV commercial, and in fact print commercial also, for a luxury car. And the tagline of the advertisement was, "You are what you drive." More recently, Lexus, in its New York Times print advertisements, has used the word envied, and it's suggested in the Lexus advertisements that if you drive a Lexus, you'll be envied by others. The implication being it's a good idea to be envied by others. It is interesting, I think, that Hitler's Ministry of Propaganda and also the great communist propagandists, I don't think could have done any better than the Lexus advertisers or the advertisers for the other luxury car I alluded to before, in terms of trying to condition people, manipulate people, brainwash people in a certain way. I remember years ago I read a superb book about the advertising industry and the strategies it uses to try to sell products. And the book had the very appropriate title, The Hidden Persuaders. It was written by Vance Packard. I don't know if one can still purchase the book, but I suggest that if you are interested in the advertising industry, and again, the strategies it uses, so as to defend yourself against some of these strategies. Again, the name of the book is The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard. Wise people, of course, wise people look at advertising and TV with a very critical eye. And also, wise people don't blindly follow the majority. The great thinkers are agreed that only a minority of people have wisdom. Goethe, the famous German intellectual, said this: "It is unthinkable that wisdom should ever be popular." If one allows TV and advertising to dictate how one lives, I think there's a very good chance that one will end up a rather envious person, self-centered and very anxious. Another possible standard we can use to determine whether our lives have been successful or not, and so many of the great thinkers talk about this, is the ability to enjoy one's own company, the ability to be alone. An important question is this: can one live a fulfilling life if one can't stand being alone? In other words, if one can't stand one's own company. Poet, musician Bob Dylan, in the first volume of his autobiography, which was recently published, speaks about his wife, and he says that his wife has never depended on any other person, including him, for her happiness. He said she had a built-in happiness, that she's the kind of person who can enjoy her own company, who can enjoy being alone. What are some of the possible consequences of not being able to enjoy being alone? Well, psychologists and psychiatrists will tell you that one of the more common consequences is bad relationships, sometimes bad marriages. Marriage therapists will tell you that many people get married not out of love, but rather out of fear of being alone. Erich Fromm, in the best book I know on the subject of love, a book entitled The Art of Loving, said this: the ability to be alone is the condition for the ability to love. The ability to be alone is the condition for the ability to love. The idea is that when we love someone, we come together with that person because we wish to nurture that person. We wish to enrich that other person's life and not merely simply avoid being alone. Also, in a good relationship, we can help another person grow spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually. Another reason for the importance of learning to enjoy one's own company is that no one of us will ever find the perfect friend. So many of the great thinkers have commented on friendship. Emerson said this. Emerson said that friends such as we desire are but dreams and fables. And Henry Adams, Harvard professor who wrote a terrific autobiography called The Education of Henry Adams, he said this about friendship: one friend in a lifetime is much, two are many, three are hardly possible. Thoreau raised the possibility that we can be more lonely when with other people than when alone. Here are Thoreau's own words: we are, for the most part, more lonely when we go abroad among men than when we stay in our own chambers. So many of the great thinkers have pointed out that we can double our pleasure in life and make our lives a much more successful experience if we can enjoy our own company. After all, enjoying one's own company doesn't mean we will not enjoy and cannot enjoy other people's company. The idea is this: when we don't fear being alone, life has a much sweeter flavor. Again, when we don't fear being alone, life has a much sweeter flavor. More tranquility, among other things. Again, among the standards we might use to determine whether our lives are successful, besides the ones I've already mentioned, self-respect and the ability to enjoy solitude, another one the great thinkers allude to is perseverance. Perseverance. The idea that if one is living successfully, one can persevere in the face of life's inevitable difficulties. Difficulties such as money problems, enduring illness, divorce, injustice. My guess is all of us in life at one time or another suffer some kind of injustice at someone else's hands. The Stoics, a group of philosophers of antiquity, said that there is a ferocity in life that must be confronted. Thoreau said that life is a warfare, a struggle, and we must act as warriors do in battle. Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck put it this way. He said life is difficult. Christianity teaches that life is a trial. And again, poet-musician Bob Dylan, in his autobiography, which I alluded to before, he says that when he was a teenager, his grandma, who incidentally had one leg, gave him this advice. She said, "Robert, be kind to everybody you meet in life, because everybody is fighting a very hard battle." And in Shakespeare's Hamlet, in perhaps the most famous soliloquy in all of literature, Hamlet says this. He refers to, and I'm quoting him, the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, in his very fine book entitled Man's Search for Meaning, says that our lives can be successful if we can bear suffering with dignity. He says that's one of the standards by which he judges whether his own life and other people's lives are successful. Again, the ability to bear suffering with dignity. And he goes on to explain what he means. If one handles suffering with dignity, it means that one doesn't use one's own suffering as an excuse to make other people unhappy. Indeed, one's own suffering can lead to more compassion for other human beings. Viktor Frankl talks about elderly people and the satisfying memories many elderly people can have about looking back on their lives with pride at their perseverance in dealing with life's endless problems. In fact, psychiatrist Frankl raises this question: why should old people envy young people? Why should old people envy young people? He says this: yes, the young have possibilities, but the old have realities. He says the virtuous old have the realities of work done, of the reality of caring for others, of the reality of difficulties bravely borne, of trying to be a decent person in a world in which many people don't act decently, of having been strong enough to play by the rules in a world in which many people don't play by the rules. I must tell you that Viktor Frankl, this very famous psychiatrist whom I'm talking about, Viktor Frankl encountered much suffering in his own life. He was a Jew in Europe at the time Hitler was in power, and Frankl, ended up being an inmate in a Nazi concentration camp for approximately 3 years, and more than a few members of his family perished in concentration camps. So this very famous psychiatrist knew intense suffering very intimately. Frankl, in his book, again, Man's Search for Meaning, a book I highly recommend, he says that our mission in life is to join the minority. Our mission in life is to join the minority. What's he talking about? Well, let me quote him. He says this. He says we must join the minority of decent people. He says decent people are in the minority. And he says what's more, decent people will always remain in the minority. And he says our challenge in life is to join the minority, to join the decent people who comprise this minority. What do you think? You're watching Life, Love, and Philosophy. This program airs on Sunday evenings at 10 p.m. on Channel 35 and is repeated on Tuesdays at 8:30 p.m., also on Channel 35. Today's topic is success and what the great thinkers have said about it. Specifically, what standards have the great thinkers suggested we use to determine whether our lives are successful? I must tell you that the most common standard the great thinkers use is virtue. The great thinkers say that if we have used the golden rule as our guide in daily living, that's a very good indication that our lives have been successful. And of course, what is the golden rule? Well, as most of you well know, the golden rule is the idea that one should treat other people in the way one wishes to be treated by other people. Houston Smith, the great and famous professor of comparative religion, who has spent a lifetime studying the major religions and has written several very interesting textbooks about them. In fact, one of his textbooks that I highly recommend, and again it's a textbook in paperback, is a book called The Illustrated World's Religions. Professor Smith says this about the major religions of the world. He says that there are many significant differences in what they teach. But Professor Smith says that one of the similarities in all of the great religions is that all of them, in one way or another, teach the golden rule. Again, do not impose on others what you do not want imposed on yourself. It is also interesting that, of course, virtue involves promoting happiness in the world. Again, it doesn't simply involve being a just person, although that's what it mainly involves, but it involves promoting happiness in the world. One can, of course, argue that if you're promoting justice, you're promoting happiness in the world. Schopenhauer, the great German philosopher, said this about philosophers and the standards they use to determine whether one's life has been successful. Schopenhauer has said that all of the great philosophers agree that virtue consists primarily in not hurting other people, and indeed helping other people as much as possible. This reminds me of something the late writer-performer Spalding Gray wrote about. Spalding Gray was hospitalized some years ago after a very serious automobile accident. And in one of his essays, he points out that while he was hospitalized and suffering pretty intensely, he asked one of the nurses, "Do you fear death?" And she said no. In a very placid way, she said, "No, I don't fear death." And she said, "The reason I don't fear death is that I believe the only sin in life is hurting other people, and I've never hurt anybody else." Virtue, of course, as I indicated before, means fighting for justice, not injustice. And why do I add not injustice? Well, because I think it's fair to say that some people in business, politics, and education fight to preserve institutions and ways of doing things that don't hurt people, that don't help people, that don't help people, and indeed might hurt people. Well, why is it some politicians and business people and educators and people in other occupations fight to preserve injustice? Well, I think the answer is obvious. The injustice often benefits them. Even when an institution is not working well to help other people, it may be working well to help the people who run that institution. Many of the great thinkers have claimed that they were saddened in that success for so many people has nothing to do with being a kind, just person, but everything to do with having money, status, and expensive possessions. The Buddha referred to such people as fools, and St. Augustine described such people in similar language. I mentioned that a huge number of the great thinkers have claimed the most important standard one can use to judge whether one's life is a success is virtue, the degree of one's virtue. And let me give you a very partial list of so many of the great thinkers who over the centuries have expressed this idea that there is nothing we can do in life that is more important than trying to be a virtuous person, a just, kind person. Again, among them are the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, Confucius, Buddha, Jesus, Socrates, Plato, Hillel, very famous rabbi, Marcus Aurelius, very famous emperor philosopher, Muhammad, the founder of Islam, Spinoza, the most famous of Dutch philosophers, Kant, probably the most famous of German philosophers, Emerson, one of the great wisdom writers in the American tradition, Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist, perhaps the greatest novelist of all time, Alfred Adler, a great European psychiatrist, and Mahatma Gandhi, the great revolutionary whom some people regard as a saint. Of course, some people think it's silly to allow minds like Confucius, Buddha, Jesus, Hillel, Aristotle to set the standards for us as to what it means to live a successful life. Better that we let minds such as Ralph Lauren, Tommy Hilfiger, Donald Trump, Martha Stewart, Barbara Walters to tell us what it means to live a successful life. What we really need in life, among other things, I think, is soul food. And I think it's fair to say that soul food involves ideas that feed our souls, ideas that feed our spirits. And I think it's also fair to say that the great thinkers over the centuries are going to do much more to provide us with soul food than, again, people like Ralph Lauren and Donald Trump. Just recently, I was watching the program 60 Minutes on CBS, and they were interviewing the great basketball star Michael Jordan, and they were talking about his spectacular career in basketball. And they also talked about some of his business interests, because as you may well know, Michael Jordan has also been a very successful businessman. But there was 1 minute towards the end of the interview that I found highly objectionable. In that 1 minute, Michael Jordan was shown on a basketball court, again being interviewed by CBS's Ed Bradley, and what he did was to show Ed Bradley how one can cheat in basketball in such a way that the referee wouldn't see it. He talked about and demonstrated how one can drive towards the basket and grab on to the defender in such a way that he becomes momentarily immobilized, giving the offensive player the advantage. And I found it incredible that on nationwide television, Michael Jordan would show children and others how to cheat successfully in basketball. I've also been disturbed over the years by baseball sportscasters who, when they talk about the possibility of major league pitchers throwing illegal pitches, such as spitballs, or throwing brushback pitches, deliberately throwing out a batter to try to intimidate them, I've often got the impression from the sportscasters that they are telling the viewers that it's okay to do these things if you can get away with it. I don't know that I've ever heard a sportscaster talk about the idea that throwing an illegal pitch is cheating, and therefore it's something one shouldn't do. And I've been fascinated that it seems that there hasn't been much of a reaction on the part of viewers, whether it's the Michael Jordan interview or, again, these baseball sportscasters not condemning some of the cheating that may go on in baseball. And it's interesting, if one contrasts the lack of outrage, as far as I can tell, among viewers, with the outrage that viewers showed over the Janet Jackson Super Bowl episode, whereby one of Janet Jackson's breasts apparently was bared. And it leads me to thinking this. I've gotten the impression that in America, the sex sins and sexual indiscretions are considered far worse than dishonesty, than sins of dishonesty. In fact, I find it interesting that many famous Protestant ministers and some Catholic bishops spend a lot of time talking about abortion and gay marriage, but as far as I can tell, very little time talking about dishonesty in politics, in business, in education, in sports. What do you think? Is it possible that one dishonest politician, business person, athlete, can do far more harm than exposing a female breast? Indeed, do politicians sin? Do politicians sin by making gay marriage a bigger issue than the role of money in politics, the destruction of the environment, and political lobbying as legal bribery. Again, what do you think? So far, in talking about success and what some of the great thinkers have said are some of the standards we might use to judge whether our lives have been successful or not, I've mentioned self-respect, perseverance, and virtue. Let me add another one to that list. So many of the great thinkers have said that if we have been good lovers, if we are good lovers, that's another indication that our lives have been successful. And again, by good lovers, they don't mean people who are sexual gymnasts, but rather people who are caring, nurturing, and affectionate. If one has helped other people in dealing with life's difficulties, that's a good indication one has been a loving person. And so many of the great thinkers emphasize the idea that we should be more interested in loving other people than in being loved. Gandhi put it this way. He said this: "What matters, after all, is that our capacity for loving ever expands." And Confucius pointed out that our love should expand from loving our family members and friends to loving society at large, and then humankind at large. Professor Joseph Fletcher, a professor of ethics, he used to teach at Brown University, I think put it very well, when he was asked to define love. He said, love is justice. He said they're synonymous. When you love people, you treat them justly. When you are just, you're loving people, whether you realize it or not. Next week, I'll provide part 2 of my discussion of what the great thinkers have had to say about success, and again, what standards we might use. Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."